My mother's new fiance wants me to call him Dad. He's 24. Growing up, I had always been close to my mother. It was just the two of us for as long as I could remember. She was my rock, my protector, the one who made sure I was always safe and loved. My father had left when I was just a baby, and although I never truly understood the complexities of their separation, it never felt like it mattered. My mother always assured me I didn't need to worry about anything. She would always be there for me. I had seen her date a few men over the years, but none of them ever lasted long. She would talk about love and about finding someone special again, but those relationships seemed to fizzle out after a few months. It never bothered me much, as I had gotten used to it. I didn't need anyone else but her. Our world was small, but it was ours, and I was content with that. But when she met him, it was different. His name was Ben, and he was younger, so much younger than my mother. I remember, the first time she introduced him to me, how she spoke about him with that twinkle in her eye that only someone truly in love could have. At first, I didn't think much of it. He seemed nice enough, a little awkward, but kind. He was charming, and he made her happy. I had no reason to dislike him. But as the months went on, things began to change. The more time they spent together, the more I started to feel like an outsider in my own home. I could tell my mother was happier, but I also felt a growing tension between Ben and me. It wasn't something I could put into words at first, but there was a shift in the air. Every time he would enter the room, I could sense a change in the atmosphere, like the room had become smaller, and I was slowly being edged out of it. Ben was always polite, but something about his demeanor made me uncomfortable. He never really seemed to understand the boundaries of my relationship with my mother. It was as though he wanted to insert himself into a place that wasn't his to occupy. I could feel him trying to carve out space for himself as a permanent fixture in our lives, but I wasn't sure how to make sense of it. My mother had always been so fiercely independent. I couldn't wrap my head around the idea of her needing a man in this way. But then came the request, the one that would change everything. One evening, after dinner, Ben casually suggested that I start calling him Dad. The words hung in the air, as though they had been said too easily, without thought. I stared at him in shock, trying to process what he had just said. My mother, who had been quiet up until then, looked at me with a mixture of hope and anticipation in her eyes. She didn't say anything, but her gaze seemed to be pleading with me to understand. The idea of calling him Dad was unfathomable. I was 19, and he was 24, barely older than me. How could I possibly call him Dad? It felt wrong, like some kind of intrusion on my past, an erasure of the life I had known before he came along. My father was absent, yes, but that didn't mean I needed a substitute. I didn't need someone to fill his place, especially not someone so close to my age. I wasn't ready to give up the relationship I had with my mother for the sake of pretending that Ben could be a father figure to me. I could see the frustration on my mother's face as she tried to explain how much this meant to her. She wanted us to be a family, to embrace Ben as part of our life, as her partner, and I understood that. I understood her desire for a future, for a stable, loving relationship. But the idea of Ben in that role, the idea of him being a father to me, felt like it would completely upend everything I had known. It was a boundary I wasn't ready to cross. But as the days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. Ben would bring it up casually, almost in a joking way, but I could hear the underlying seriousness in his voice. "You know," he would say, "you can always call me Dad." It would mean a lot. The words stung more each time. It was as though he was demanding my approval, my acknowledgement, before he was even ready to fully understand me. He was acting as though our relationship could be fast-tracked, as though time didn't matter, as though his age and experience didn't matter. I felt cornered, trapped between wanting to respect my mother's happiness and needing to protect my own identity. I had grown up without a father, yes, but that didn't mean I needed one now. I had lived without him for so long, had learned to navigate the world on my own. I wasn't a child anymore, and I didn't need a replacement for what I never had. But Ben wasn't asking for a replacement. He was asking for a title dad, and that was a line I wasn't ready to cross. As the tension between us grew, so did the distance. My relationship with my mother started to change too. She became defensive, protective of Ben, as if she saw me as a threat to their happiness. The once open communication we had began to crumble under the weight of this new dynamic. It was clear to me that she was invested in this relationship, maybe more than I could ever understand, but it hurt. It hurt to feel like I was being pushed aside, like I was being asked to accept something that didn't feel right. My mother had always been my only constant, and now it felt like I was losing her. Bit by bit, she was no longer just my mother. She was someone else's partner, and that, more than anything, was what was hard to accept. In the silence that followed each conversation about Ben, I withdrew further. I spent more time in my room, alone with my thoughts, feeling isolated in a house that no longer felt like home. Every time I saw Ben and my mother together, laughing or talking in that way that only couples do, I felt like an intruder in my own life. It was a slow unraveling of the bond I had with my mother, a bond I had always taken for granted. She wasn't just my mother anymore, she was his fiance, and I didn't know how to bridge that gap. Eventually, I stopped fighting the feelings of discomfort. I had to accept that this was her choice, that Ben was here to stay, whether I liked it or not. But what hurt the most was that I couldn't get her to understand why it was so hard for me. She saw it as a simple request, a way to bring us closer as a family. But for me, it felt like an imposition, a demand that was impossible to meet. So I kept my distance, pretending to accept things as they were, even though deep down, I felt like I was losing not just my place in her world, but a part of myself in the process. I didn't know how to reconcile the love I still had for my mother with the discomfort I felt toward her new life, her new family. And I didn't know how to make her see that sometimes, some things were just too big to rush into. But as time went on, I learned that not everything could be fixed or understood right away. I couldn't force myself to call him dad, but I couldn't stop my mother from loving him either. We were all just trying to figure out where we fit, and sometimes, the hardest part of that was realizing that the space I had once occupied was now shared by someone else. And all I could do was watch, from a distance, as everything I had known slowly changed. The months passed, and the tension between Ben and me continued to grow, slowly but steadily. Each day, the undercurrent of discomfort seemed more pronounced. My mother's insistence that I give Ben a chance grew more frequent, and every time she mentioned it, the distance between us widened. I could see the love in her eyes when she looked at him, and that only made it harder to bear. I wanted to be happy for her truly. I wanted to see her in love again, to see her content. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was asking me to sacrifice too much of myself in the process. I spent more and more time outside the house, avoiding the awkwardness that loomed when we were all together. I spent hours walking through the city, wandering without any real destination, as if I could outrun the weight of what was happening. I would try to distract myself with friends, but even they couldn't understand what I was going through. My friends hadn't experienced the kind of bond my mother and I shared. They didn't know what it felt like to have that bond threatened by someone who wasn't just trying to step into our lives but was demanding a place in it. I had moments where I tried to talk to my mother, tried to make her understand why I was struggling with all of this. I would open my mouth, only for the words to get stuck, like they were too painful to speak aloud. The guilt I felt for not being able to accept Ben as part of our family was overwhelming. I could see her disappointment in her eyes when I would withdraw, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was expecting me to just accept it, to just get over it. But it wasn't that simple. How could it be when the very foundation of my life was being rearranged before my eyes? One evening, when I returned home after one of my long walks, I found the house unusually quiet. My mother and Ben were in the living room, but there was something different about the atmosphere, a kind of heaviness that filled the room. I stood in the doorway, hesitating before walking in. The moment my mother saw me, her face softened, but I could see the sadness behind her smile. Wasn't the kind of smile I had grown up with. Ben looked up, and for a brief second, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe guilt, maybe regret. It was hard to tell, but it was enough to make me feel small, as if I was the problem, the one holding up this idea of a happy family. I felt myself retreat further into myself, like a shell closing in around me. My mother stood up and walked toward me. Her hand brushed against my arm in an attempt to comfort me, but it only made the distance between us feel more pronounced. Her touch, once warm and reassuring, now felt foreign. She spoke softly, telling me how much Ben meant to her, how much she wanted me to accept him into our lives. I nodded, but the words hung in the air, and answered. I didn't know how to tell her that the more she asked, the more I pulled away. But what hurt the most was when she finally said it, when she told me, in that quiet voice that used to be filled with understanding, that maybe I just needed to give Ben a chance, for her sake, that if I loved her, I would try. That maybe it was time for me to accept what was happening and stop making it harder than it had to be. Her words felt like a betrayal. Not because I didn't understand her desire for happiness, but because it felt like she was asking me to sacrifice too much. I had spent my entire life thinking that we would always have each other. I never thought that love could come between us, but now, it felt like her love for Ben had started to eclipse everything else, and I was being asked to fit into a world that wasn't mine anymore. I spent that night alone in my room, staring out the window as the city lights flickered in the distance. My heart ached, but it wasn't just for myself, it was for my mother too. I could see how much she wanted this, how much she wanted us to be a family. But in trying to make me accept Ben, she had unknowingly created a rift between us, one that was hard to ignore. I could see that she had already chosen a future with him, and all I had left was the past we had once shared. It was then that I realized I was not just mourning the loss of a bond with my mother, but the loss of a sense of self. I had spent my life being her child, her only child, and now I had to learn how to be something else, something different, something less. It was a painful realization. The idea of accepting Ben into our lives, of calling him Dad, felt like I would be forced to give up the last remnants of the childhood I had held onto so desperately. And yet, there was a small, fragile part of me that wanted to be happy for her. I wanted her to have the love she deserved, the companionship she had longed for. But I also wanted my mother to see me, to understand that I wasn't ready to let go of her, not yet, not this way. The days passed, and the tension between us only grew. Ben's presence in our home became harder to ignore, and the more I tried to avoid him, the more it seemed that my mother was pulling me into a situation I wasn't prepared for. I still couldn't bring myself to call him Dad, and I still couldn't bring myself to accept him the way she wanted me to. But I also couldn't find the words to tell her that I was hurting, that I needed more time. I was stuck in a limbo, caught between love and resentment, between wanting to protect my relationship with my mother and feeling like it was slipping through my fingers. My mother's world was changing, and no matter how hard I tried to hold on to the past, I realized that sometimes change was inevitable. The more I thought about it, the more I understood. It wasn't about Ben being a bad person. He wasn't. It wasn't even about my mother's happiness. I could see how much she wanted this. It was about me learning how to let go of the only version of my family I had ever known and accepting that sometimes growth means change, even painful and comfortable change. But that didn't make it any easier. And so, day by day, I took small steps. I didn't call him Dad, and I wasn't ready to. But I did start to try. I began to spend more time with Ben, not as a father figure, but as a person who mattered to my mother. It wasn't easy, and it didn't always feel right, but I was trying to find a way to bridge the gap. Because no matter how hard it was, I couldn't ignore the fact that my mother needed me to try, and maybe, just maybe, I needed to try too. As the weeks went by, I began to notice small changes in myself, though I wasn't sure if they were for better or worse. My attempts to bridge the gap between Ben and me felt strained, like I was trying to force a connection that wasn't there. At the same time, I couldn't shake the guilt that weighed on my chest whenever I saw how hard my mother was trying. She wanted so badly for us to be a family, to create a new version of our lives where we could all coexist without resentment. But with every passing day, the gulf between my reality and hers seemed to widen, and the more I fought it, the more I felt myself retreating further into myself. Ben, for his part, tried to be patient. He could see that I wasn't ready to accept him, but he didn't push. He made an effort to be polite, to be courteous, but it was clear he was frustrated. My indifference toward him, my inability to welcome him the way my mother had hoped, was something that seemed to weigh on him, even if he didn't say it aloud. I could see him watching me, almost studying me at times, as if waiting for me to crack, waiting for me to finally break and call him Dad. But I wasn't ready. Not yet, maybe not ever. One evening, after dinner, my mother invited me to sit down with her, and then the three of us gathered in the living room. I had been avoiding these moments, hiding in my room or leaving the house, but tonight, I stayed. I knew my mother was trying, and despite my reluctance, I knew that I couldn't hide forever. She smiled at me, her face soft, her eyes full of hope that I might take a step forward. I sat on the edge of the couch, my hands resting in my lap, my gaze fixed on the floor. She spoke quietly, her voice trembling slightly, as she explained how much she wanted things to work. She talked about how hard it had been to start over after so many years, how much Ben had come to mean to her. Her words were full of love, and I could see the sincerity in her eyes. But the more she spoke, the more I felt myself shutting down. The knot in my stomach tightened, and I fought to keep my emotions in check. My mother's need for us to be a family, her longing for things to be different, echoed in every word. But I couldn't force myself to give in. I couldn't pretend that this new life didn't feel like a betrayal. Ben shifted uncomfortably next to me, his gaze flicking between my mother and me. I could tell he was trying to make himself invisible, trying not to be a source of tension. But his very presence was a constant reminder of the fracture that had formed between us, and no matter how much he tried, I couldn't make myself accept him, not as my father, not as part of my life. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until I finally spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. I told my mother that I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to call Ben Dad, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. I told her that I needed more time, that I needed to figure out how to navigate this new reality. I could see the hurt in her eyes, the disappointment that I wasn't meeting her expectations, but at that moment, I realized something. I wasn't asking her to choose between me and Ben. I wasn't trying to tear apart the relationship they were building. I was just asking for the space to process everything, space to grieve the loss of what I had once known, space to figure out who I was now that everything had changed. My mother looked at me, her face a mixture of sadness and understanding. She didn't say anything in that moment, but I could see the silent acknowledgement in her eyes. She knew I was struggling. She knew I was trying, even if it didn't look the way she had imagined. I could almost hear her thoughts in the quiet room, the pain she felt knowing that her own child wasn't ready to accept the life she was building. Ben, for the first time, spoke up. He didn't push for me to call him Dad or try to force some kind of bond. Instead, he simply told me that he respected my feelings and that he didn't want to rush anything. His words didn't make everything better, but they softened something inside of me. For the first time, I felt like he saw me not as an obstacle or someone who was holding up their happiness, but as a person trying to navigate something difficult. That small moment of empathy made a difference, though it wasn't enough to make me feel like I could accept him yet. After that night, things didn't magically improve. I still struggled with the idea of Ben being in our lives, still found it hard to adjust to the changes that had taken place so suddenly, but something began to shift inside me. It wasn't a complete transformation, and it wasn't a resolution to all the tension that had built up, but it was a glimmer of hope, a tiny step forward. I realized that I didn't have to make a decision about Ben all at once. I didn't have to label him or accept him into my life in the way my mother wanted. What I needed was time, and as much as I hated to admit it, I knew that my mother needed Time to. The love she had for him was real, but so was my need to find a way to navigate this new family dynamic. Days turned into weeks, and gradually, the atmosphere in the house started to shift. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but we began to coexist more peacefully. My mother and Ben continued to build their relationship, and I tried to be there, even if only in small ways. I started to join them for dinner again, though I never stayed long. I didn't force myself to play the part of the happy family member. I simply tried to exist, to take things one day at a time. And through it all, I started to realize that I didn't have to choose between the past and the future. I could hold on to the memories of what we once had while also allowing my mother to build a new life for herself. It was a painful journey, but it was one that had to be taken. And though I wasn't ready to embrace Ben as a father figure, I understood that acceptance didn't have to happen all at once. Maybe, in time, I would be able to see him as part of our family, maybe not. But for now, I needed to find peace in the space between where I was and where my mother wanted me to be.